Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. I call the Space Court Foundation video series to order. Welcome. My name is Chris Hearsey, and I am the co-founder and chair of the board of directors for the Space Court Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for our video series program titled Operating in a New Space Age, Does Space Security Matter to Industry? The Space Court Foundation is a 501c3 educational nonprofit corporation that promotes and supports space law and policy education and the rule of law. The Space Court Foundation produces educational materials and scholarship through the administration of several major projects that includes our animated space law program titled Stellar Decisis, which will launch on July 20th, our research program under the Space Court Law Library, and our new YouTube series called The Space Bar Show. The foundation also engages in partnerships and collaborations that help grow greater awareness of space law and how disputes in space may be resolved as humans venture further from Earth in the not too distant future. For more information about our mission, programming, and internship program, we ask that you visit our website at spacecourtfoundation.org. We also wish to thank Open Lunar Foundation for sponsoring our video series for all of 2021. For more information about the Open Lunar Foundation, please visit their website at openlunar.org. We greatly appreciate the strong support of the space community. Invite you to follow us on social media for the latest information. You can find archive versions of all our programs on YouTube. Just search for the Space Court Foundation channel. If you enjoy our programming, please remember to like today's video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your continued support helps us to keep providing you contemporary and innovative programming. Please consider supporting us through Patreon and our merchandise store, Celestial Objections Apparel, on teespring.com. All proceeds go to the foundation to cover the costs of our programming and support our intern projects. Before we begin, I would like to thank our moderator, Mari Eldholm, from the Norwegian Industry Forum for Outer Space, and all our participants for joining us today, and look forward to an amazing conversation about how to reduce space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. Finally, a big thank you to our Director of Programming, Leticia Zarkan, for organizing this excellent program. I now turn over the program to our moderator, Mari Eldholm.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you also to the Space Court Foundation for taking the initiative for today's webinar. And just before we start, just a small personal caveat here, because actually I finished up at NIFR last week, and I will join the Norwegian Space Agency in the fall, but right now I am technically between jobs. So just to keep it neat and tidy, I would just like to emphasize that I'm here in personal capacity today. And then perhaps also a confession, because I am actually not a space security expert, but I have dabbled and worked with both government and industry actors on related topics for the past few years. And from said dabbling, questions arise. And as such, I am so very pleased that I get to moderate today's panel and ask all my questions to the panelists. So the inspiration or motivation for today's seminar is, as was already mentioned, the recent United Nations General Assembly Resolution 75/36, which is a renewed attempt to initiate a global discussion on how to reduce space threats through norms, rules, and principles for responsible behavior. And we have in the past few weeks and months seen a number of states and NGOs become more active in the follow-up of this resolution. But today, we would like to hear from what is an increasingly important stakeholder in this regard in relation to space security, namely industry. And what we would like to discuss with our expert today is how important is the mitigation of space threats for commercial operators? Are security threats something they are concerned with on a daily basis? If so, what are the security challenges that they are experiencing? And can and should commercial actors be part of the international dialogue to improve space security? And if so, what can they contribute with? We realized that while setting up today's program, that security might mean different things to different actors, even if we lump them all under a group and call them industry. And in order to hear from the different perspectives, we wanted to include experts from different industry actors involved in different parts of the value chain. And it is my great pleasure to confirm that we did just that. And starting from the ground up, our first panelist represents a launch company. And it is, of course, Rada Popova, who is the legal counsel for ISAR Aerospace, a launcher company based in Europe. And then moving a little bit further in the value chain into orbit and satellite activities, we have Therese Jones, who is the Senior Director of Policy and at the Satellite Industry Association. Apologies. They are, of course, based in the US. And lastly, from the industry side, also in orbit and everything on orbit related, SSA, space debris removal, and so on, we have with us Toby Harris, who is the Space Situational Awareness Head at Astroscale. And in addition to this, we also wanted to include a point of view on how the industry perspective correlates with the actual debates at the UN when it comes to space security. So our fourth panelist is Daniel Porras, who is, of course, the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communication at the Secure World Foundation. And I'm sure most of you already know Daniel, as he is, of course, also involved, or the founder behind the organization we're here with today. And he has, of course, also been following debate at the UN for a number of years. So that is the panel. And then just a quick note on the format before we get started. So we will kick off the seminar with some questions from me. And of course, in dialogue then with our panelists, we will have this going for about 30 minutes. And then we will also open up for questions, comments, whatever else from the audience. So feel free to engage with us in the chat interface, and we will select some of the questions after the first 30-40 minutes. So with that, it is time to get started. And to ensure we are all on the same page, I think we should start with the basics. Because I have noticed that when I talk to different actors, they seem to have quite different ideas or definitions of what space security and threats actually are. And as we now have representatives from different parts of the value chain, I would like to kick things off with a short but large question to all our industry panelists, starting with you, Therese. And the first question is space security something you discuss within your organization? And if so, what does it entail? And what are the threats that you perceive for satellite operators?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. It's a very good question. So when we talk about space security, I think one of the oldest domains that the commercial industry has been impacted by is radio frequency interference. And there's been a lot of coordination at the ITU level and then within the US at the FCC for many decades. So concern about, coordination with spectrum usage and also intentional interference such as jamming. I'll just give two examples quickly now that we're in Eurocup and Copa America mode of these of interference or unintentional and intentional interference. Back in, I think it was 2004, there was a spectrum coordination demonstration that was being done by the Bolivian government. And it was during the World Cup. A third of households lost World Cup coverage because they were getting it through satellite. And, that was a huge economic loss for Bolivia. And just shows, how difficult some of these interference issues go, even if you're trying to coordinate. And then there was another issue back in the 2010 World Cup where the Jordanian government was blamed for interrupting an Al Jazeera broadcast of the World Cup as well. And while those were, government level issues, jammers have gotten much cheaper and easier to use by non-state actors. So that's of increasing threat, not just to our TV broadcasts, but to communications, whether that's for civilians or for military government usage. And then another issue that has become more prominent recently is cybersecurity. It's always been an issue for our government end users. Most of the systems that our member companies run are used by the US government. So generally have strict cybersecurity protocols, but there's increasing interest in coordinating right now on best practices in cybersecurity. In the US, there was a Space Policy Directive 5 put out at the end of the Trump administration that asked industry to coordinate under the Department of Homeland Security best practices in this domain. And they have a working group on this. But it's even, basics like having encryption for your space systems that are not something that is commonly used by especially new space actors that needs to be discussed. There's a big issue also, not just with space and ground systems that you commonly think of that are run by the satellite operators, but issues with the equipment that's used by the end user. I remember there was a demo a few years ago where there were white hackers, so good hackers, that were able to take control of a ship using VSATs and just redo their coordinates, GPS coordinates. Because the VSAT used default login credentials for all VSAT terminals, they never bothered to change it. So anyone who knew the VSAT default login credentials could automatically change the ship's location, which obviously is not a good scenario. So many layers to cybersecurity in space, some that you don't commonly think about. And then the final area that I wanted to cover was space sustainability, which I'm sure some of our other panelists will cover more, but that is an increasing issue for us, just being able to coordinate with other actors in space and share information to ensure that there aren't any on-orbit collisions.
Thank you, Therese. And then maybe throw the ball over to you, Toby. Do you discuss space security at Astroscale? And if so, what does it entail?
Yeah, we do talk about space security, and I guess there's two main angles that we kind of look at. One is what I would consider the effect on the mission itself, the effect on the spacecraft and the ground segment and our own operations. And most of that is concerned with the sort of more traditional, more industry-wide impact of cybersecurity and cyber threats, things like denial of service and sort of the low-level, high likelihood but low impact kind of risks that most industry and companies kind of deal with every day. And so that's obviously very important, protecting a space company's IP and also trying to ensure that we protect the operations themselves as well, the unique part of a space operator that sort of distinguishes us from a significant part of the space industry and the industry as a whole. And so we think about that quite commonly. We want to try and make sure that those operations are protected. The ground segment is obviously a very vulnerable part of the sort of space operations process. And so we want to try and ensure that that area is well considered. And that's one of the things that's always kind of at the forefront of our minds. However, as well as just the impact on the space mission itself, the direct impact, as it were, we're also cognizant of the broader environmental impact that space security has. So the actions of state actors and non-state actors in space, how that then falls into the perception of people's activities in space. Ultimately, because Astroscale are involved in active debris removal missions, very much a dual-use technology, a dual-use activity, and to have a negative perception of those kind of activities from an international point of view isn't going to help our business case. It's not going to help regulators license these activities, and it's not going to give confidence in what we're doing is an acceptable activity in space. And so trying to ensure that there's a perception of that these activities in space are acceptable, that they are transparent, and that that these threats to other space actors are well considered in the space environment is really important to us as well. So both those areas, both from an operational point of view, but also from a political point of view as well.
Thank you. And lastly, to Radha, is space security something a launcher company is interested in? And if so, what are the threats you are worried about?
Yeah, perhaps other than the first idea that would come to somebody's mind, that probably it's more satellite operators and end users that are concerned with space security. Of course, it's also a big topic for launcher companies. And again, we come back to what you, Marie, said in the beginning, that space security is just such a huge topic. It's rather a set of single topics. And as we heard also from Therese and from Toby, it means many, many different things at a time, including but not limited, of course, to cybersecurity. And it does entail also possibly, especially for states, the military security aspect. And as we are all developing dual-use technologies, the topic of security as such is definitely prominent. It is just that the launcher company does not face exactly the same issues and concerns as satellite companies. But on the level of sustainability and on the level of being very much concerned about the negative impact that any space activity, be it satellite or a launcher activity, may leave into space, we are also investigating ways on how to minimize our own impact. Even though we're not a satellite, we do transport satellites that remain in orbit. And even though our rockets will come back, we are very much focusing also on the topic of sustainable use, transparency also in this regard, and working together with stakeholders from the government, but also from the industry, to ensure that this common resource that we are all sharing continues to be usable for everybody.
Thank you. So yes, not an easy concept to nail down, and that takes us to our non-industry panelist. Daniel, you have followed the UN debates closely, and perhaps you can help us here. And does the UN operate with a definition of security, and if so, does that correlate well with what you heard now from industry?
Sure. So at the UN level, we often split the discussion about threats to space sustainability into two categories. There's the safety element, which is very much involved with non-intentional activities that can lead to accidents, potentially damage something or cause another incident, but there was no malice behind it. On the space security side, now we're starting to talk a little bit more about activities where there is intention, where somebody is intentionally trying to do something that is aggressive or hostile. And so for years and years at the UN level, there's been a great deal of discussion about, okay, we're starting to see more and more countries use space capabilities to support their military activities. Now we're starting to see some countries are starting to develop counter space capabilities in order to be able to negate those advantages. Do we need some rules? Do we need some guardrails to make sure that the types of weapons or the types of activities that start or the types of activities we start engaging in aren't going to harm that critical infrastructure element that supports people every day? Making things a little bit more complicated, though, is we're starting to see this trend where the commercial and the military sector are really kind of blending together, where many militaries are purchasing services from commercial actors. So I'm actually quite hopeful based on this conversation that we're having, because one of the concepts that keeps coming up in these UN discussions is, how do we get more transparency? It would help if we could just tell what folks are doing, and if we knew, like, what is the purpose of this operation? Where are you going? What are the intentions? And so, especially for a company like Astroscale, where they are developing technology that is dual use, multi-use, could have a whole variety of applications. It's great to see that they are being very open about what their activities are, what the technological parameters are, of course, without divulging too much information, but being very, very open so that everyone can kind of see what's happening. And we hope, at least at Secure World Foundation and of course at the UN level, that kind of transparency will enable us to have these technologies that could potentially be harmful, but because you're using them in an open and transparent way, it kind of cools tensions and prevents those misunderstandings.
So you addressed here the transparency and the distinction between security and safety, but there's one topic that's been mentioned by all our industry panelists here, which I don't know if it's being discussed at you, and that is cyber security in space. Is this something that's currently being discussed at the UN level?
Yeah, absolutely. But when we think about it, at least at the UN level right now, they're still kind of considering space as the platform. And so that's the infrastructure, it's the hardware. And then the cybersecurity element is sort of more the software and the integrity of the system as a whole. But certainly we've been seeing examples where there have been cyber or hacking compromises of certain space systems, the most famous of which I think is probably the two NOAA satellites, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association of the US. I think in 2011, they had two satellites that were taken over by allegedly Chinese sources for up to 9 minutes each, which that's a really long time to have full control of a satellite. So that's also being looked at the UN level, but mostly that's still being kind of left over to other groups that are looking at cyber issues.
Yeah. With that, I would like to make a bit of a bridge to the second topic. It was already mentioned here that we're now seeing more states, in particular, developing counter space capabilities and these kind of things. But at the same time, we're perhaps seeing that some of the most infamous incidents have been largely due to misconceptions. So I would like to explore a little bit with all of you, how do we avoid misconceptions or misunderstanding related to space activities? And perhaps I'm more naive, but I am still less concerned with commercial actors engaging in hostile acts. But I do think it's possible that non-governmental entities, including industry, could be the source of a misunderstanding, because a lot of these activities have dual use potential. And as we've already discussed a bit, information is not always something that's shared broadly. So there have been misconceptions or uncertainty relating to the exact nature of some activities. We all have you here now, and you are experts in your respective fields. And I would like to do a little bit of a hypothetical exercise and try to identify what activities or situations you in your field that you think could be particularly prone to misconceptions, and what we could potentially do about that. And I know some of you have touched a little bit upon this already, but see this as an opportunity to expand a bit. But perhaps we start with you, Toby, a two-folded question. What activities in your field do you think could be the most prone to misconceptions, and what steps do you think could be taken to avoid any such misunderstandings?
I mean, I think that when you're talking about space security, basically, if a spacecraft or somebody operating a spacecraft is doing something that's completely unexpected, something that people had no expectation they were going to do, if they're perhaps wandering towards somebody else's spacecraft or doing something that they hadn't publicized, it hasn't part of what the original mission was about, that's always going to start to raise some suspicion. And when that kind of thing happens, you start to get into a scenario where you can have misunderstandings and miscalculations, particularly when you're talking about spacecraft that are perhaps between different nations or different spacecraft operators, not necessarily just commercial, but across the whole kind of board, I guess. And there was, I mean, a good example of one of these kind of misconceptions, or perhaps a grey area where, you know, it's not entirely clear what somebody's doing, was the recent plane matching by a Russian spacecraft to a US military satellite sort of just a couple of years ago. And this is a great example of how, you know, they were basically doing something what I would consider to be perfectly safe, perfectly sustainable, you know, following guidelines, but they're still in that kind of grey area of, well, what are they actually doing there? This is something that's, you know, it's not written down anywhere, but it's not what we consider to be a normal behaviour, or something that perhaps is you know, unwritten down, but is sort of not acceptable, as it were. And so it's those kind of activities. Likewise, if one of our Astroscale missions, one of the services decide to wander towards somebody else's satellite without any warning, no coordination, again, it's unexpected, it's not been publicized, people don't know what we're doing, why we're doing it. We might have some heritage in what we're doing, which might help, but at the same time, for a new spacecraft operator doing something like that, again, it would raise suspicions and potentially result in misunderstandings and miscalculations. So I guess in terms of avoiding that, oh, go ahead, Daniel. Did you want to mention something there?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, like, as a follow-up, are there, when looking at your missions and things that Astroscale is going to be doing, are there requirements on the type of information that you have to publicly release, or is this something that Astroscale just does on their own?
There are no requirements, as far as I'm aware, about what information you have to publicly release on your space mission. Obviously, we're subject to the rules of UK Space Agency. They're our licensing body. And again, you know, for Spectrum, there's the FCC and Ofcom, etc. But there's nothing there that explicitly says that we have to publicly make available information about our flight plan or our missions or what we're trying to achieve. As far as we're aware, anyway, this is something that we try to make sure that we do ourselves. And actually, this leads on to kind of the follow-up in terms of the misconceptions. It's all about transparency. Like I say, there's not necessarily any rules or any guidelines that say that you have to be transparent about what your mission's doing. Obviously, you want to be safe. You want to try and ensure you've got sustainable activity. But really, we want to try and make sure that transparency is sort of that key part of building confidence in us as a spacecraft operator and what ADR and end-of-life missions are all about. And you know, this is to do that. It's kind of a multi-pronged thing, really. Certainly, having accessible space situational awareness made available to those parties is really, really important. You really want to know what's happening in space in order to kind of demonstrate actively what you're doing and why it's safe, whilst you're kind of following what you publicize, what you've been doing. It's all very good us saying one thing, but then not actually having any way to check it. You need that kind of independent verification outside of just regulators, outside of government, so people can actually say, yes, this is what they said they were doing, builds confidence, and ultimately what works in sort of everybody's favor.
Perhaps also just a quick follow-up from my side. I think it's great to hear that you guys are taking a lead on transparency and sharing more than is required. And you mentioned also publicizing information, and I would just like to ask, where do you publicize information? Where do you share it?
So obviously we use our website, so we make sure that what we're doing is on our website. We have as much information as possible about the mission itself and the demonstrations. We currently quite regularly use social media, so Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, all the above, basically try and make sure that we're as current as possible on what we're trying to achieve. And also during conferences, so Space Debris Conference by ESA, Space Symposium, AMOS is coming up, various others conferences. We like to make sure that people are apprised of what our mission's about, what we're trying to achieve, as well as actually sharing data. So we've made the offer to share things like the ephemeris data for the missions, to say where our satellite's going to be, when it's going to be up there, what it's going to be doing, that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of different forums that are available that we try and make use of.
Do you think there could be a need for more? Oh, sorry, Daniel.
So I just wanted to comment that that's especially compared to a lot of state actors at the UN level. That's way more information than we typically get. There is a UN registry, but typically it doesn't get updated with space activities until sometimes months after the fact. And it's very slow in coming. And so I think, especially for activities like what the Russians were doing, even if what they were doing was perfectly benign, where would we even begin to know what they were doing in the first place? So it's really, really encouraging to hear that the commercial sector is so much more open and willing to be transparent with their activities.
Yeah, perhaps also another follow-up just when we're on this topic, because I think it's interesting to spend a bit of time on it. Do you think there should be more of an international coordinating way to exchange information more in real time? Is this something you
absolutely.
guys would appreciate?
I mean, there is a registration agreement, and there are some certain requirements about trying to update national registries so that international actors can know what's going on. But none of these are openly publicized. There's no central registry where all of the information is being gathered. Everyone can do it sort of at their own will. It's very voluntary, and it's just not updated very well. So when we see these new types of activities, novel activities, experimental things, everybody, especially with the geopolitical situation the way it is, everyone assumes the worst.
Yeah. Toby, I saw you were unmuting again. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, no, not at all. No, it's absolutely. I mean, this does kind of lead into the world of space traffic management and coordinating what people are doing and when they're doing it as well. I mean, again, that's very much focused on the safety side of things. But I think you could probably expand upon that and use it as a way to understand and build confidence in how people are or how people are actually performing their missions, what they're intending to do as well. I mean, as well as the registry, there are obviously things like Space Track, the 18th Space Control Squadron's open source information repository, which tells you some information about where the spacecraft can maneuver and kind of where they're going to be, that kind of thing, which is a bit more up to date in the registry. But again, it's focused very much on safety, and perhaps having that additional steps to understand sort of the motivations as well about what these satellites are actually doing would be very helpful.
Yeah, no, I think this is an interesting discussion that we should continue, but I think we need to change over to a different part of the value chain. And Rada, same question, which I can remind you what it is because now we talked a bit. So what activities in your field do you think could be the most prone to misconceptions, and what steps should we take to avoid any misunderstandings?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. And of course, when we think about launches, the dual use comes always in the first place, missile technology. But I guess that the new space industry, and we would all agree that most probably not only space debris removal private companies, but also launchers are not really keen on providing specific hostile or military activities, but much more actually supporting and acting towards missions that contribute to not only to peaceful use of outer space, but also to a meaningful, sustainable use of outer space. And you can only achieve that, of course, if you have the necessary means to access the orbits and get these, let's say, clean space satellites up there. But of course, there are also a number of misconceptions. And I feel that even on the national level, there is a big, sometimes probably hostility is too strongly said, but misconception of the importance of new space and of space actors. So I feel sometimes that states might be too reluctant, for example, to engage more actively with their own industry representatives, and rather than, I don't know, supporting the new way they're paving, sometimes it might be that states are actually reluctant or waiting for too long until they offer some support, be it on the political or on the regulatory level. And in this sense, I think the topic of this webinar is extremely important to also showcase that industry not only must have a say, but it helps if it has a say, because at the moment we see that it's the industry that really is at the forefront of creating the new technologies and the advancements, while the states might be still in a position to be very conservative and let's say not be as innovative as they are. But this misconception also on the level of national regulatory bodies, I guess, might be a big topic for some companies as well, be it outside Europe or within Europe.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I will ask you a follow-up question on that when we move a little bit later into the discussion, because I think that's very interesting to follow up on. Just on a quick note, I have to apologize for the background noise there. I think my neighbor is tearing down his kitchen or something, so please just excuse that.
We don't hear it.
Okay, perfect, because here it got very loud very quickly. But we're going to continue up our value chain again and up to the satellites. And Therese, ask you the same question. And if you need a reminder of the question, please let me know.
That's okay. I mostly had everything that Toby said and Daniel said on my list. So registration, really important one. I've seen not particularly from our commercial actors, but in general, there being concern about registrations that take a very long time to be filed at the UN level, some even years, due to, from what I've heard, is largely administrative incompetence rather than anything nefarious, but there can be a lot of interpretations for that. And then, as Toby talked about, information sharing is huge. Sometimes operators don't know where their own satellites are, especially after launch of a bunch of CubeSats at once. So things like that can also be deemed as nefarious. Maneuvers of satellites, since there's no centralized database, was talked about to file those. And that's something that we are, one, all of those three things are part of. We came up with very high-level space safety principles, encouraging all of our operators to register their satellites and be transparent with their data, share information on their maneuvers. But there's not really yet a centralized way to do that. We're hopeful that in the US, the Office of Space Commerce's open architecture data repository will help operators internationally share that information, though sort of unclear given the current US political trajectory how that will move forward in terms of funding and operations. But something like that we think is certainly necessary. And then satellite servicing as well could have dual use purposes. And then I think one last area where there are misconceptions is in trying to figure out what is commercial and what is government. Different countries have different definitions of what commercial is. So if a US company has 90+% of their gets 90+% of their profit from the US government, are they really commercial or are they government? It's perceived different ways in different countries. And I think coming up with a common understanding of that is another major issue.
Yeah, no, I see we have topics here we could follow up on for days. But I think I will again turn to you, Daniel, and ask you a slightly different questions than the previous speakers here, but it follows the line of what I asked you last time. So I apologize for being not so creative, but I think it's interesting to play back and forth. And does what you hear from the industry experts here correlate with both the activities and solutions which are the focus of discussion at the UN? Or is there a need to sort of change the discussion into addressing some of the other things that were discussed here? And also, how can we move the urgency forward? Because what I hear is that industry actually moves faster and some of these more intergovernmental solutions.
Yeah, no, actually, some of the things that we're hearing are, they very much correlate with recent comments that were submitted to the United Nations on behalf of a number of states saying, look, these are our concerns. And one of the big things that often comes up in the conversation, and going back to what Radha was saying, is states recognize, look, we are not the major players in outer space right now. It's the commercial sector. They're the ones who are doing all the fun and exciting things. So how do we loop them into this conversation to make sure that they're able to, one, actually update the international community about what the technology can do. What are the technological realities? So many diplomats, we hear things and hear rumors about, people working on space lasers and, grappling arms and space harpoons. And so we just imagine the wildest things. And as a consequence, sometimes the discussions don't necessarily match up with reality. I can't believe that, we're still talking about, US space-based missile interceptors, despite the fact that we've, already proven that it's economically unfeasible, at least for the next few decades. But here we are. So I think definitely finding avenues to get the commercial sector more involved, to bring a sense of reality to what is actually being done in space and what the technology can do would certainly help. The other thing that I really like, in terms of what we're hearing that I think the UN will be very receptive to is space traffic management. If we can come up with a baseline set of norms for the way actors behave in space, just you don't get too close to somebody without their permission, or you don't start doing like these weird maneuvers that could potentially bring you into a collision course with somebody else without notifying them or something to that effect. Some of these baselines, what they'll do is that states can start looking at things and saying, okay, this is what a normal actor does. This thing that you're doing over here is really weird. Nobody else does that. It goes against the norms that we've established, and you haven't told us anything about what you're doing. We're going to interpret that as being hostile. But at least there's kind of an objective baseline that people can actually point to and say, this is normal and this is not. Otherwise, much like what happened with some of Russia's activities, as well as some certain American activities, they do something that is unusual, and the folks on the other side automatically say, that's hostile. Is it? I mean, sometimes it looks like it's perfectly normal and safe, but we don't have anything to compare to. So I think those are the kinds of discussions that that folks at the UN level are going to want to start to have, and they're going to want to hear from industry. Okay, what is normal behavior? How do you normally act? I'm sure they'll come to Therese at some point and say, all right, Satellite Industry Association, what do you think about these kinds of norms or setting out these types of rules? Or they'll come to Astroscale and say, okay, we're trying to figure out, what are the necessary requirements for active debris removal? Tell us what a normal, responsible actor would do. And that's certainly where I think they're going to try to start roping in industry a lot more. Now, there is some division on how that should be done. Some countries think that industry should first deal with their, with their country representatives, and then the representatives should take it to the UN. There was a big discussion about that at the UN recently about non-governmental organizations, whether or not they should have to go through their delegate states or their host country before they're actually able to deliver their views. And a lot of countries say, no, that it shouldn't be that way, because industry and NGOs and other actors might disagree with the government. They might have different perspectives and different interests, and they should be able to present those perspectives without being filtered through the government.
Yeah, no, this leads us perfectly into the sort of last topic I was hoping to address, which is really how do we all together improve space security, and what should the role of industry be? So thank you for that perfect bridge. But perhaps coming a bit back to you, Radha, who mentioned sort of the interplay between governments and industry. And I know you're a space lawyer, so I would like to get your take on, what do you think the solutions should be? Do we need international treaties or regional standards or even technical standards good enough? Do you have any opinions on this?
Oh, that's a very good question, and everybody from the space industry, and especially the people who have a legal background, have been tackling these issues for decades now. And yeah, most of us are acquainted with the fact that the most legitimate body that we have on the international level, namely UN COPUOS, is sometimes, well, failing to come up with binding solutions, with binding treaties, because of the consensus principle. As you probably know, even the questions such as delimitation between airspace and outer space. Now, whether we need it is another question, but even the decision on this point has been taking more than 50, 60 years now. So apparently there is a need to somehow overcome this kind of stalemate in creating binding rules. And it might be even naive if we continue to be in the same set, needing a consensus in UN COPUOS, which grows and grows and grows, to expect that it would be, on the short term, easy to come to a new binding international agreement or even to amend the existing agreements. But what I think everybody can agree is that we do need rules. Now, the question is, what shape should these rules take? Of course, we have this division between binding, non-binding rules, and obviously the UN COPUOS and also other fora have been quite successful in producing such non-binding rules since the 80s. As we know, our main concern, space debris, has been addressed quite adequately by the IADC, not by UN COPUOS. And later on, the guidelines for space debris mitigation became such a huge reference point, not only for the UN COPUOS endorsement, but also for national laws. So obviously, I think we cannot really put all our cards on one solution, like aiming for a binding treaty on a UN level is probably something we can wish for, but not something that we pragmatically should expect. On the other hand, only producing non-binding rules, as we know, is also not sufficient. Not only because they are only voluntary, but also they tend to have a very general nature. And I think states as stakeholders have an extremely important role in this regard, because they can streamline, they can stimulate the creation of binding rules, at least on the national level, but then from there on also transfer it perhaps to the regional or even to the international level. So I see national law creation as a very important source in the way forward. And of course, in combination with input, we should not be dogmatizing non-binding rules. But I guess we should not only find ourselves trying to create non-binding rules only, because the time is not really on our side. The problems that we're facing are just too crucial and too irreversible in their nature. So we don't have too much time to spend on just producing very general things. And I completely agree with what also the other panelists have been saying, that space traffic management is a huge thing. And as space security, it also entails so many single elements. And we just we need to start doing things, as the ESA, I think, puts it. It's time to do it. And we really are in the situation in outer space. So it would be really great if more and more states actively engage, if they're not too reluctant, and perhaps instead of trying to find the perfect solution, try at least to find pragmatic solutions.
So clear speech there. It is urgent, and we need states to come to the table and start finding solutions. But this actually does bring me to the next question, which I would like to ask Therese. Do you think space security is a topic that we should leave to the states and the UN, or should commercial actors be included in this discussion? And if so, what can you contribute with?
I absolutely think commercial actors should contribute to the discussion. It made sense back in the day when there were more government-owned satellites in space, many more government-owned satellites in space than commercial, to run everything through government representatives at the UN level. But we're at the point where the number of commercial satellites on orbit far exceeds the number of government ones. And the number of commercial satellites in space is only going to grow exponentially. So if you don't have those major stakeholders at the table with even thousands of satellites on orbit, and you're funneling them all through, many of them through the US government. We have a great relationship with the State Department, but not everyone has the same perspective on these issues. And I think it's important to include these actors in these dialogues. We definitely need industry-led best practices as well. I already mentioned we have high-level space safety best practices, also have high-level cybersecurity best practices. But I think that's where a lot of the work is going to take place before it is more formalized in any sort of law. And I'm also hopeful that we can work with government entities to include international actors in some of these discussions. For instance, the US Department of Commerce signed some SSA data sharing agreements with other countries, but hopeful that can be, a starting point for discussions on space traffic management, not just bilaterally, but including commercial actors in hopefully like-minded countries, and then maybe coming up with some new norms.
Thank you. And just if people haven't checked them out, I do encourage to go to the websites and check out these standards. They're very interesting. And then to you, Toby, does this correlate well with the perspectives you guys have at Astroscale, or do you want to be included in the debate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in terms of solutions, I mean, being pragmatic, I don't think there's going to be a treaty anytime soon that's going to deal with a lot of this stuff. I think it's going to be down to consensus amongst countries at the UN, perhaps following in a similar way to the LTS guidelines, the long-term sustainability guidelines which were successful a couple of years ago. Their implementation, perhaps a follow-on to that, looking at how responsible behaviours could perhaps be quantified and how that could be pushed forward to spacecraft operators at a national level. One thing I would say is that, as was alluded to earlier, I mean, a lot of spacecraft operations now are performed by commercial actors. And so actually it's a licensing function in nations who kind of have some responsibility in ensuring that what goes into orbit is really appropriate. And it's a tricky one because whilst the licensing function and the regulators are very much a national entity, you can't really do that in isolation. You can't unilaterally license in one particular way, trying to ensure that we are licensing responsible operators in the UK, for example, and then let people who don't want to do that disappear off to another country completely and get licensed through another way. So it's important that it's done at a national level, but also that those regulators are talking to each other, that there's kind of consensus between how regulators should be looking at commercial operations, seeing whether they're happy with what kind of missions are going into orbit, what kind of technologies, what kind of capabilities, what they intend to do with those capabilities, and who they're going to sell their data to, for example. All these kind of questions, ultimately the liability for those commercial spacecraft falls upon those nations. So it's important those regulators kind of work together there.
Perhaps just a quick follow-up on that very thing, because we're seeing now more and more countries are indeed developing national space legislation to deal with their international obligations and try to encourage sustainable and safe use of outer space. But do you experience that there are very different standards set in different countries? Are these laws coordinated, or are they in practice quite different?
From my own experience, then yes, I think different countries tend to license spacecraft operations in a very, very different way. Some are quite well established. France, for example, has quite a well described regulatory framework. The US has traditionally one rooted in the FCC, and I believe is looking at how it could develop a spacecraft operations license as well, possibly through commerce or something like that. But there are countries, new space actors, I guess you could consider them, who perhaps don't have much experience in how licensing spacecraft or regulating missions, and perhaps may need that guidance, may they need that additional support to ensure that how they license is kind of consistent with sort of what we might consider an international best practice. So I think there is quite a lot of variation between how different nations license and regulate spacecraft. Yeah.
So perhaps contribution to all of this could also be to have better coordination between national legislations to ensure that we're all held to the same standards.
In an ideal world, absolutely.
Perfect. Let's see. Daniel, I would like to turn to you again, because I think both from being here and also the comments they have now given, it's clear that industry want to contribute and have much to contribute with. So I think it's, and you alluded to it before, but I think it's still interesting to just go a bit more specific into the matter. Are there ways for commercial actors to engage with the dialogue at the UN at this point?
Yeah, so at the moment, there are certain countries and certain fora that are very open to getting industry input and listening to what it is that commercial actors are not just engaging in now, but what they're planning on engaging in the future. So, like Therese said, the U.S. State Department, I think, has a great relationship with the commercial space sector. They do a number of things to try and do outreach. The UK government does as well. Many of the European countries in general have that sense that they are benefiting greatly from the commercial space sector. So they want to make sure that they adopt rules that are going to be conducive to the commercial space sector. That works pretty well in the safety side of things. But once you start talking about security things, because we're talking about national security, because we're talking about, possible nuclear escalation, the conversation takes a slightly different tone. And so it almost comes to a question of, well, the commercial actors are facilitators in this area. They can help out at a technical level, but really it's ministries and departments of defense that have to be making these decisions, because we're talking about potential nuclear annihilation. So suddenly that seems to trump a lot of the other perspectives. So in that sense, one of the things that we've started seeing considerably more is that industry is just stepping up and saying, you know what, while you folks figure out that political side of things, we're just going to start organizing ourselves and trying to figure out how we can start to come up with our own standards of coordinating cooperation and behaviors. Secure World Foundation has been working quite a lot recently with CU Boulder, and actually I could tell a little bit about this one, because the gentleman who was very much the brains behind this effort passed away recently, but he had a wonderful idea to start bringing together different members of industry to talk about very specific issues, such as determining right-of-way. If we're looking at two satellites potentially colliding, what kind of criteria can we look at to determine, like, okay, who's gonna get out of the way? And some of these rules, some of the self-organization really helps the security side, because like I said before, it gives us a better sense of more transparency, more clarity, and more regular behaviors that you can say, all right, that is a normal, responsible standard of conduct. Now we could just kind of focus on the other things that are floating around beyond that. So I would continue to encourage industry to self-organize, to look, if governments aren't coming up with new rules, get together amongst yourselves, see what you can come up with. And then once governments start seeing that industry is organizing itself in such a way, they can also turn around and say, look, industry's already taking care of this problem. They've already come up with certain solutions that work for development of this exciting new area. Let's make sure that whatever rules we come up with aren't going to be drastically different from what they've already managed to put together. And that's one way that I think industry could really help push some of the norm building.
Just to ask one question, which kind of comes back to the very first, where we talked about what is security, and if I understand you correct, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I understand it is difficult to involve industry in the topics that are more security related in the UN sense, but I mean, because we are talking dual use, do you think this distinction between safety and security is useful when discussing policy and legal frameworks?
Yes and no. It is useful in the sense that it keeps certain safety issues from being dragged down by security discussions around, especially nuclear systems and other strategic weapon systems. that stuff can mire a conversation in political grief for decades. I mean, we've been talking about the prevention of an arms race in outer space since before I was born, and here we are. We're still talking about it with very little to show for it. So in that sense, I do think that it's important to try and keep them separated. But we also have to accept that there are safety threats that can have security consequences, and there are security threats that can have very serious safety consequences for everybody. Every country depends on space. We are all space users. So there has to be that engagement, there has to be that dialogue, and we have to kind of break down the silos and invite different stakeholders into the conversation, because we just don't have no one group, no one community in space has a full grasp around how interconnected all these different pieces are.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's that's certainly true, as we discovered just from our discussions today. And I would like to encourage the audience to ask questions, and maybe I could also ask someone in the organization to just help me monitor the question section here. Daniel, if you want to take a look and jump in, please do so. In the meantime, I would be interesting to ask one of our industry panelists, and feel free to jump on this, whoever want to, because all of you have mentioned that you already have had quite successful dialogue with governments on the national level and given input and on a number of different issues, it sounds like. Is there anything from government industry dialogue on a national level that could be used in an international dialogue? Like, are there lessons learned here? Anyone want to take it? If not, maybe Therese.
Well, I think I brought this up before a little bit. We've worked with the U.S. government a lot on, what should go into an open architecture data repository if one should come to fruition, and what transparency and data sharing looks like, the utility of including maneuvers, data formats, et cetera. And that's sort of what I was hoping would be ported along with the SSA data sharing agreements to other countries, and having industry involved in that conversation as well. So we get a lot of people who are pro data sharing into this conversation internationally.
Thank you, Rada. Is there any lessons from maybe more the European side on how you guys work with government and the dialogue there, and how you could also take that good experience into an international dialogue?
Yeah, well, in fact, in Europe, there is lots of dialogue going on, both on the national, but also on the regional level, under the framework of ESA for the ESA member states and their companies, but also within the EU and increasingly in the EU. So I would say the dialogue is quite vivid, and I'm under the impression that it's going to become more and more intensive, even though there might be some differences in terms of the single country. Some countries seem to be on the governmental level much more acquainted with the space sector and much more proactive, and other states perhaps need some additional push.
Toby, do you want to jump on this one, or?
I mean, I guess from my experience I used to work for the UK Space Agency just before I moved to Astroscale, and so I've kind of seen it from both sides of the fence. And I think actually Astroscale was quite a good example of how communicating with government really helped in terms of understanding the mission and what the company's objectives were and that kind of thing. Pushing that to the international scene, I think it really is just I don't know if there's a way to take that and directly apply it to conversing with the international community. But I think, in terms of how to license, how to regulate, I think that communication is really important. And so by sort of using that as an example and perhaps pushing that through the space agency to our international colleagues of an approach to regulate, an approach to build that partnership would be quite a good way to start, I think.
Daniel, I would like to come back to you, and because you are today the UN perspective, and as we know, the ITU has for a number of years included industry in its discussions. Do you see any chance of this being replicated on the, let's call it space side, so not frequency?
Yeah. From the safety side, absolutely. I think especially at COPIOS, we often see kind of technical presentations and different engagement with industry. So just so that diplomats can have a better understanding of what we're working with. That is not necessarily the case for the security side of things. I hate to say it, but active debris removal right now is one of the boogeymen. Everyone is looking at close proximity operations as being, kind of this specter. And in part because we haven't started seeing that many operations yet, no one knows what to expect. But it would be great if we could also have technical presentations and sort of demo type things for the security community, maybe in Geneva around the Conference on Disarmament, or in New York at the General Assembly, just to say, look, this is what the technology is intended to do. This is what we're trying to design it for. The Secure World Foundation just had its summit on space sustainability, and somebody from ClearSpace made a really great comment to this question about, people are worried that active debris removal devices will be used to attack other satellites. And they said, but from a technical perspective, that's crazy, because you wouldn't use a garbage truck to attack a tank. It's just not fit for purpose. Okay, but a lot of folks at the UN level don't know that. We don't understand what it actually takes. Another example of a phrase that gets used constantly is, well, everything in space is a weapon. Technically, you could use any satellite to ram it into another satellite. Sure. Do you have close approach technology? Do you have the necessary cameras and equipment to be able to actually engage in that? I mean, I could say that I'm going to take a VW bus in California and run it into a, commercial vehicle moving across Italy at 120 miles an hour in 3 days' time. But a lot of things have to happen for that to take place. Diplomats often think, oh, well, you can just turn a satellite right around and hit it into something else in a matter of moments. It doesn't work that way, but we need that engagement. And so maybe that's part of the job for academia and civil society, is to bring in the industry and say, hey, here are some forums. We're going to invite diplomats to come and talk to Astroscale, to your SpaceX's and your, other important space stakeholders out there, so that you can actually learn a little bit about what the technology is intended to do and what its limitations are.
Yeah. No, I'm having a look in the comments here, and to follow up on that, how do we create the awareness that a change is needed and that industry needs to be created? And someone asked, should we have a Unispace for a conference? Could this be something to create the momentum and change?
Yeah, maybe so. But I think already we're seeing from industry a lot of, I don't want to call it outcry, but there is pressure. They're saying we need new guidance. We need legal certainty. We need physical security. And in order to do that, we're going to need some kind of a harmonizing framework. That's been helping a lot. But obviously, it hasn't gotten to a level, I think, yet where there's the necessary sense of urgency. My only hope is we don't get to an accident, and that is what ends up triggering the reaction.
Yeah, no, for sure. Then we have a question on STM, space traffic management. And I guess this could be either for Toby or Therese. Do you imagine a space traffic management regime in the future, which is like air traffic control today, with satellites getting clearance to launch and inserted into assigned orbits? Are we getting this detailed? Therese, maybe you want to start?
I think we're a long way off from that, just because of the level of international coordination that needs to happen. We would need to have some sort of internationally recognized space traffic management authority at the UN level. And I haven't seen, while Russia would like that to happen, there have been a number of actors that do not see Russia as the ideal country to run this. So I think we're a pretty long ways away from that. And also then you have the competitive issues of how many satellites can be in one certain orbital plane. Some companies say, for instance, they might have active collision avoidance. How do you differentiate between them technically, and operators who might not have that capability? I think we're a pretty long way off from that.
Toby, are you more optimistic?
Well, I mean, in some ways, we kind of already do the whole getting clearance to launch and insert into assigned orbits through the licensing process in the first place, the kind of authorization. You can work out when they're going to get launched, and you can work out where they're going to go, and that's kind of what they have to do. space traffic management more for me is kind of more dynamic nature of how spacecraft are all coordinating with one another in orbit. And I think we're still, as Therese said, we're still a little way off from that. There's still a lot of work that has to be done in terms of the sort of the logistics of sharing data, how it can actually be done in a simple and sensible way. And then there's there's quite a lot of issues around sort of national boundaries and that data sharing side of things. So I think it's definitely something that we need to do. It's something that we need to push on, but I think it's still a few years away from us yet.
And then I realized that, of course, for a launcher company bringing satellites up, this is also an important topic. So I apologize about that. Do you have any perspective on how do you see STM being realized? Are we getting there? Is it urgent from you guys' perspective?
On the urgency, yes, absolutely. And we do not see it only from the perspective of a launcher, where the risk for the launching for the launch rocket might be smaller than for a satellite. We see it from the perspective of the space industry as a whole, and from the industry of a functioning, ecosystem between providers, operators, and users. Now, as has just been said, we're probably still far from a real functioning unified STM framework. But on the other hand, on the positive side, we hear much more about STM in the past years than we did before. Same goes for sustainability. Now, basically, you do not hear or read any space article without the word sustainability. But if you go back 3 or 4 years ago, that was not really yet the case. So the awareness is growing, which is a very good sign. And even though we must be a bit cautious with the idea of having an STM very soon, this does not mean that the single elements of STM are not already available, at least partially, and we can work towards them.
And then perhaps one last question to you, Daniel. Is it possible to have a STM framework that does not touch upon security? Or is security an inherent part of STM?
No, I do think that we can have a space traffic framework that will apply to all actors, including the military. The military is not exempt from the Outer Space Treaty, for example. So, or from the IT. Well, in some cases they are exempt from certain IT regulations. But nevertheless, like there's still a lot of there are a lot of principles and norms that even military actors will abide by. When we have rules for the ocean, for example, like if you are a naval carrier, with lots of weapons on board, you try and stay in certain areas so that you don't spook anyone. Likewise, if you're a fishing boat, you don't get too close to said military vessel because they might blow you out of the water. I certainly think that we could come up with effective and equitable guidelines, or at least some kind of a framework, so that everyone is just sort of following normal traffic standards. As a result, because even the military will have to abide by those standards, it'll be a lot easier for us to detect and determine potentially hostile activities. And that just makes everybody a little bit less nervous. I think it gives everyone a little bit more assurance that their space systems are going to be resilient and that they'll be available when they're needed. Right now, I think a lot of the tension is just coming from the fact that people don't know what is possible, and they don't know what the intentions out there might be. So, especially with industry, who's developing all the great, exciting new technologies, it's important to recognize that they can also be disruptors.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good note to maybe start wrapping up on. And in conclusion, I hope that people feel that we've answered the big question: is industry interested in space security? I think we can conclude that's a big yes. Can they contribute with things? I think that's also a big yes. We already have examples where, industry is not just leading the way technology-wise. They're also creating both transparency practices, but also coming up with standards and proposing things and pushing for things. And what I've heard from our whole panel today is that this is urgent. So we hope that, of course, states will do their parts, but also that you can lean on industry to also do their part, because I think at the end of the day, This is their bread and butter. And if you want to continue to be a space company, you have to be able to use space. It's that simple. And that, of course, goes for all of us in a modern society. We all need space. So with that, I think I will conclude my part and just say a big thank you to all the speakers who participated today, and of course also all the listeners, and also the organizers, in particularly Letitia and Daniel, who have handled the day-to-day organization. And I do believe there will be some concluding remarks. So Daniel, I believe that is you.
Thank you so much, Marie. And thank you for hosting a really great panel. This discussion was excellent. On behalf of the Space Court Foundation, I just want to thank everyone also for attending. Big thanks to Letitia for organizing everything. She is the brains behind this operation. We couldn't do it without her. Also, many thanks to Therese, Rada, and Toby for joining us this afternoon or morning. You can be sure that I will be sending this conversation over to Ambassador Little over at the UK mission to the UN in Geneva, just for their information, because I think it will be very interesting for member states to hear what the concerns are of industry as well. And hopefully these comments will all get incorporated into our discussion that will eventually unfold at the UN General Assembly. So thank you very much to everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thanks again, Marie.
Thank you.